Rusty McFix, real name classified, but everyone calls him that now. Never thought farm boy from Kansas would qualify him to be stranded in deep space by an ungrateful pack of alien technocrats. Yet here he was, standing in the command center of Zeta 42 Bioneural Research Station, aka the Screaming Metal Death Trap, as the last Zorpian shuttle detached and glided gracefully into the void. The doors behind him sealed with a hiss, leaving nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the faint, wet slurp of the walls. Yes, the walls slurped, because Zorpians didn't believe in things like normal or comfortable. They built their stations like living things. Veiny, pulsing, slightly damp things. Rusty watched the shuttle's thrusters fire. He waved cheerfully, even though the aliens inside weren't looking back. "Y'all take care now," he muttered. "Don't mind me. Just gonna save your superior technology from choking itself to death." He looked around the command center. The place was chaos. Panels blinked red like a Christmas tree wired by a drunk raccoon. Tubes running along the walls throbbed sickly yellow, and somewhere in the bowels of the station something groaned, long and low, like a dying whale. The once pristine Zorpian bio-wonder had become the galaxy's most expensive hospice patient. This had not been the plan. Originally, Rusty was supposed to be part of a joint engineering program. One human among a few hundred Zorpians. A noble scientific exchange. He'd learn about their miraculous biotech. They'd learn how humans could fix nuclear reactors with a hammer and some duct tape. Everyone wins. But after 8 months of learning, the Zorpians came to a stunning realization. The station hated them. Every mechanical upgrade they made, rejected. Every repair they attempted, undone. Every maintenance cycle, worse than the last. The bioneural network, essentially the station's brain and nervous system, had started to reject their advanced mechanical components like a bad organ transplant. And being Zorpians, masters of technological arrogance, they concluded the station was irreparably broken. Their solution? Cut their losses. Pack their toys. Evacuate. Leave the human behind because of diplomatic delays, and hope he didn't accidentally punch a hole in the bulkhead before rescue arrived. Rusty didn't even get a choice in the matter. Commander Velter, the Zorpian in charge, a four-armed gray beanpole with the warmth of a malfunctioning toaster, had delivered the news with his usual bedside manner. "Human Morrison, the station is doomed. We are leaving. You, wait here." To which Rusty had replied, in his best Midwest deadpan, "Oh sure, you'll go on. I'll just sit here and suffocate in peace." Velter actually nodded, as though Rusty's sarcasm were acceptance, and added something about leaving behind basic diagnostics, which turned out to be a sad little toolkit, a handful of manuals written in Zorpian hieroglyphs, and about 6 weeks' worth of bland emergency rations that tasted like chalk-dipped kelp. And now, here he was, the last human for 100 light years, standing ankle-deep in failing alien biotech, with nothing but his wits, his toolkit, and the faint smell of something organic rotting somewhere behind the walls. Rusty leaned against a nearby panel, which, naturally, squished under his elbow like a giant tongue, and thought back to what Velter had said before leaving. "Do not attempt repairs. The network is unstable. Simply, maintain what you can and wait for rescue." "Maintain what I can," Rusty muttered, surveying the forest of flickering panels and oozing conduits. "Yeah, that sounds like great advice. And if I don't, what happens? Do I void the warranty?" The station creaked in response. He sighed, ran a grease-streaked hand through his hair, and wandered back toward the engine room. The halls were empty now, just him, his echoing footsteps, and the unsettling way the walls seemed to twitch faintly as he passed. For 8 months, the Zorpians had treated him like a charming, slightly dim-witted mascot. The novelty human. Look, it knows how to use a wrench. Oh, it fixed the door with string and metal glue. Adorable. But now, they'd left the adorable human in charge of a dying biomechanical monster and given him nothing but a pat on the back and the vague promise of eventual rescue. If the diplomats ever stopped squabbling. The thought made him laugh. Loudly. The sound echoed down the hallway like a challenge. "All right, screaming metal death trap," he announced to no one in particular. "You and me. Let's dance." By the time he made it back to engineering, The temperature had already dropped a few degrees. The bio lights along the ceiling were dimmer than they had been just an hour ago, and the air smelled faintly sour. The station wasn't just failing, it was dying. Actively dying. And fast. Rusty dropped into his usual chair. Well, his usual Vena lump that occasionally exhaled at him, and kicked off his boots. Then he took out a notepad, real paper, because unlike alien tablets, paper never deleted itself when you sneezed. He drew a line down the middle. On one side, Zorpian strategy. Install more mechanical parts. Force the network to accept them. Get angry when it doesn't. Repeat until everything turns into goo. On the other side, human strategy. TBD. Don't die. Figure out why it hates metal. Make it stop hating metal. Sounds easy enough, he muttered, flipping the wrench in his hand. The walls groaned ominously. A panel somewhere behind him popped and hissed green fluid onto the floor. Rusty didn't even flinch. You done crying? Or you need another minute? He asked the station dryly. He stood and started his rounds. Life support was already limping. The air had a faint metallic tang, like blood in ozone. The Zorpians had patched it over and over again with increasingly complex systems, but Rusty could see the truth even with his primitive human eyes. They'd been bullying the station into compliance, and it had finally snapped. Well, if they wanted someone to maintain what he could, fine. But Rusty was not the kind of man to just sit in the dark for 6 months twiddling his thumbs and waiting for Daddy Earth to come pick him up. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Any machine can tell you what it needs if you stop shouting at it and just listen. So that's exactly what he planned to do. He stopped in front of the bioneural brain, an alien crystal cranial throbbing blob that was apparently the station's central nervous system, and stared down. It pulsed faintly in the dim light, the web of glowing fibers radiating outward like veins. Some glowed bright, but most were dim or darkening. Several cables were already crusted in some kind of alien plaque. Rusty folded his arms. You don't like the metal bits, huh? Can't say I blame you. Half the time they don't fit right anyway. But here's the thing. Neither of us is going anywhere for a while. So how about we strike a deal? You stop trying to kill me, and I stop calling you the screaming metal death trap. The brain pulsed, very faintly, as if to say, "We'll see, monkey." Fair enough, he said. You play hard to get. By the end of that first day, Rusty had fixed absolutely nothing, unless you counted mocking a sentient building his progress. But he'd already done something no Zorpian ever managed. He decided to work with the station instead of on it. He sat back on the floor of the engine room, staring at the faint glow of the bio tubes as they pulsed in the shadows. 6 months alone in here? Yeah, he could do that. He'd grown up fixing broken things with spit and baling wire. This was just a bigger tractor. Get some sleep, he told the station, patting the nearest panel. Tomorrow, we see what you're really made of. The lights flickered at that, just slightly, like the faintest hint of approval. Rusty McFix, it woke on his second day as the galaxy's least qualified station commander to the sound of silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence. Not the birds chirping, wheat field kind of silence he remembered from Kansas. No, this was the eerie, unsettling silence of a dying space station holding its breath before the big collapse. He cracked one eye open. The walls, which normally glowed faint purple, were now just gray. Cold. The air had gotten heavier overnight, and the temperature was sliding toward meat locker on the comfort scale. Even his little emergency flashlight seemed to flicker in sympathy. Ah, he muttered, sitting up. Nothing like waking up in a haunted coffin to start the day. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his grease-stained overalls, and clipped on the tool belt the Zorpians had thoughtfully left him, which consisted mostly of implements designed for people with twice as many fingers and 3 times as much arrogance. No matter. He'd spent enough time in Kansas adapting farm tools to do completely inappropriate things. This would just be more of the same. He trudged through the corridor toward engineering, his boots echoing on the metal floor. Without the usual background hum of the station systems, it felt like walking through the ribs of some long-dead creature. The walls twitched occasionally, like they were annoyed he was still here. Yeah, I'm still alive, he told them cheerfully. Sorry about that. In engineering, The situation had not improved overnight. The life support panel was flashing red warnings in a language that looked like a drunk spider had walked through a tray of paint and skittered across the screen. The biotubes connecting the walls to the core were turning that lovely shade of neon green that usually meant infection in humans or possibly imminent explosion in alien. Rusty crouched down and touched one of the tubes. It was warm to the touch, but the color was wrong, and, disturbingly, it recoiled slightly when he touched it, like a cat pulling away from an unwanted scratch. "Yeah," he said. "You hate me. I get it. You hated them too, though, so don't start acting picky." He pulled out his trusty notebook and started sketching what he saw, where the green leaks were, where the tubes looked angry, where the panels seemed most stubborn. He labeled everything with charmingly low-tech words like pulsating goo tube number 4 and angry wall orifice number 7. Because he refused to learn the 50-syllable Zorpian terms for things. After an hour of poking around, he spotted the pattern. Wherever the Zorpians had added mechanical components, shiny, rigid, alien metal junk, the bioneural tissue had pulled back, corroded, and started leaking. The tubes closer to original biocomponents? Still healthy, still pink and warm, and, well, less homicidal. "Huh," he said. "You're allergic to their tech." The station, of course, didn't answer, but he could feel it glaring at him somehow. By mid-morning, Rusty had worked up a theory that sounded just stupid enough to be correct. The station wasn't failing because it was weak. It was failing because it was fighting. And the Zorpians? In all their smugness, they'd treated this living station like a stubborn mule, beating it with more and more mechanical patches until it finally kicked them off its back. Rusty chuckled to himself. "Should have asked my granddad," he muttered. "You can't shoe a horse while it's trying to bite your face." On his way to the central processing unit, the giant glowing brain he'd started calling Big Slimy, he passed a particularly nasty junction box where the biotubes had gone completely black, crusted with something that smelled faintly of vinegar. This was where the Zorpians had tried to install some sort of advanced power coupler a few months ago. Rusty remembered them arguing about how their superior alloy would finally dominate the stubborn bioneural tissue into submission. "Well," he said to the oozing junction box, "that worked out about as well as hog-tying a grizzly bear." He crouched down and watched it for a while. The tube actually twitched when he got too close, like it was trying to get away from him, like it was trying to reject the metal. That's when it hit him. He'd seen this before, on the farm, when his sister brought home a stray dog and tried to feed its store-brand kibble. It wouldn't touch the stuff. Why? Because it didn't trust it. It wanted scraps. Something familiar. Something it understood. He leaned back on his heels and looked up at the pulsing walls around him. "You're just hungry for something you actually want to eat, aren't you?" he said aloud. For a second, the nearest wall lit faintly, as if in grudging agreement. The rest of the morning was spent rummaging through the alien storage lockers in the laboratory section. The Zorpians had left behind a few things they hadn't been able to carry off in their rush: diagnostic scanners, biological samples, and most importantly, a molecular fabricator, essentially a giant alien microwave that could build materials at the molecular level. Rusty stood before the machine and whistled low. "Well, hello, gorgeous," he said. "You're coming home with me." Of course, the machine was designed for four-fingered Zorpians with triple-jointed wrists. But Rusty had grown up repairing tractors with missing pedals and stripped gears. He just jammed a couple of the less essential Zorpian tools into the control interface until it started working for him. A little clumsy, but it lit up, and it worked. That afternoon, he ran experiments. He sliced off a sample of the biotube tissue and fed it into the analyzer. Then he fed in a sample of the rejected metal. The display helpfully showed two complex chemical structures, side by side, with the clear implication that they hated each other's guts. Rusty stared at the screen for a long while. "What you need," he muttered to himself, "is a bridge. Something in between. Like a translator, or a really good marriage counselor." Grandpa's voice popped into his head again. "If the graft don't take, son, it's 'cause the stock and the branch don't like each other. You gotta find a common root." Rusty slammed his fist into his palm. A graft. Yes. By evening, he'd run a dozen tests. His first attempts at a hybrid material failed miserably. One even started smoking and made the lights flicker ominously, but by attempt number 6, he had something promising. When he brought the hybrid alloy to a leaking junction and pressed it close, the bioneural tissue didn't pull away. In fact, it almost reached toward it. Tiny filaments of light extended, wrapping tentatively around the sample like cautious fingers. Rusty grinned. "Atta girl." For the first time in 2 days, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't doomed to become another cautionary tale in the annals of human stupidity. That night, sitting on the observation deck with his coffee, he watched the distant stars and thought about his day. He'd been abandoned in a failing alien station, armed with nothing but farm wisdom, sarcasm, and sheer bloody-mindedness. He'd already made more progress than the Zorpians had in months. Sure, the station was still flickering. Sure, there was still the disturbing smell of vinegar and ozone lingering in the air. But something had shifted, not just in the machinery, but in the attitude of the place. The walls didn't slurp as loudly anymore. The tubes didn't twitch as violently when he passed. The lights even seemed to glow a little brighter when he walked into the room. It was almost like the station was watching him now, waiting to see what he'd try next. He raised his coffee mug to the nearest wall. "To common sense," he said, "and to the Zorpians wherever they are, y'all keep polishing your fancy tools. I'll be over here with my wrench, fixing your mess." Somewhere deep in the station, something creaked in what he chose to interpret as agreement. By the third day, Rusty McFix was officially in a relationship with a space station. Not that he'd admit it out loud, of course. But you don't spend 72 hours patching up someone's leaking organs, coaxing their nervous system into calming down, and telling them bedtime stories without starting to feel something. Besides, the station had clearly started to like him. When he walked through the corridors now, the walls no longer flinched at his touch. The lights even brightened, just slightly, as if to say, "Ah, the human's back." About time. Rusty stopped in front of one of the main biotube junctions and crouched down. The hybrid material he'd installed yesterday, the 6th, finally successful alloy, was now fully embraced by the surrounding tissue. Pink fluids coursed happily through the veins instead of that sickly green slime that smelled like old socks. He grinned. "Well, would you look at that? You're healing. I knew you were just being stubborn." The wall pulsed faintly in response. The rest of that morning was spent experimenting. Rusty didn't have much left in the way of food, unless you counted the Zorpian emergency rations, which he absolutely did not. One more bite of that kelp-flavored chalk, and he'd hurl himself out an airlock. But what he did have was a station full of underused alien equipment, a rapidly improving attitude, and the unstoppable momentum of a human with nothing better to do. He approached the central boneural brain, which he had upgraded from big slimy to partner in his head, and sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it. The crystal tissue brain glowed faintly, its nerve fibers twitching rhythmically as if in thought. "All right, partner," Rusty said. "I've proven I'm not here to kill you, so let's see what else we can do together." He pulled out his notebook and sketched another plan, replacing more junctions, repairing more circuits, and even reinforcing the compromised power conduits that the Zorpians had abandoned entirely. And here's where things got interesting. When Rusty stood up to install the next hybrid connection, the bioneural network helped. He froze mid-motion as tiny tendrils of biofiber extended toward the junction, almost like fingers ready to guide the piece into place. "Well," he said, "that's new." The lights around him flickered. Not the angry, about-to-die flicker, but a kind of smug twinkle. Like the station was saying, "Took you long enough, monkey." Rusty chuckled. "Fine. You think you know better? Show me." From that point on, repairs went faster. Every time he approached a junction, the bioneural tissue would extend guide fibers to meet him halfway. Sometimes it would even pulse differently, subtly lighting up one area of the wall or dimming another, almost as if it were suggesting which connection to tackle next. At first he thought he was imagining it, but after an hour of following its silent suggestions, he realized that not only was he getting more done, but the station was already stabilizing itself ahead of him. "Well," he muttered, "you could have told the Zorpians you wanted a partner instead of a dictator. But no, you had to sulk and try to strangle them with your own guts. The station made no reply, of course, but the light at the base of the brain flared, just a little, as if acknowledging the jab. By the end of the week, Rusty in the station had developed a full working routine. In the mornings, he would walk the halls, clipboard in hand, inspecting the areas that needed attention. The station, which seemed to know when he woke up, would softly brighten the lights in the direction it wanted him to go. In the afternoons, he'd sit by the molecular fabricator and churn out more hybrid connectors, sometimes even experimenting with different organic coatings to make the tissue accept them faster. At night, he'd sit in engineering with his boots propped up and sip the last of his coffee while the walls around him pulsed quietly, like a giant sleeping animal at peace. The station had even started preparing for him. One morning, he found a toolkit waiting outside his quarters, fully stocked, arranged just the way he liked it. The next day, the walls had grown a small alcove near the main junction, perfectly sized to hold his coffee mug while he worked. "You're spoiling me," he said to the brain one evening. The brain pulsed softly, the nerve fibers glowing with what he chose to interpret as shy amusement. The partnership blossomed into something more ambitious when Rusty stopped thinking like a repairman and started thinking like a designer. Sure, the Zorpians had only cared about keeping the station alive long enough to evacuate. But now that the station trusted him, he figured, why stop at stable when you could shoot for spectacular? He sat down in front of the bioneural brain and pulled out his human tablet. He had already modified it to talk to the station after a lot of trial and error, and one memorable moment where the station briefly shut off gravity just to make a point. "Okay, partner," he said, tapping the screen. "Here's the deal. You've got the brains. I've got the opposable thumbs. Let's build something better." He sketched a schematic for a more efficient power grid, combining traditional electronics with bioneural tissue. Then he added a few notes about extending life support to areas the Zorpians had sealed off months ago. When he plugged the tablet into the wall port and uploaded his plans, the response was immediate. The walls flared brightly, and the brain pulsed so rapidly that Rusty could actually feel the excitement in the air. "Well," he said, "at least somebody appreciates my ideas." Over the next few days, their cooperation deepened. Rusty would sketch an idea. The station would modify it, sometimes subtly, sometimes completely, and light up areas to indicate better alternatives. He started to realize it understood engineering principles he hadn't even learned yet. And not just understood them, it improved them. When he suggested rerouting power through unused conduits, it showed him a hidden network of tunnels that didn't even appear on the Zorpian blueprints. When he mentioned reinforcing the failing supports near the aft section, it began growing new structural fibers before he could even finish his sentence. And when he idly wondered if they could grow a small hydroponics bay to replace the chalk ration nightmare the Zorpians had left him, well, the next morning there was a neat row of sprouting alien plants by the kitchen alcove. Rusty stood there, dumbfounded, and then laughed until his ribs hurt. But the best, the absolute best, moment came when he was replacing one of the last major junctions in the core systems. As he slid the hybrid connector into place, the station didn't just wait for him to finish. It reached out, wrapped its fibers around his hands, and helped. He froze, staring down at the glowing tendrils curling gently around his fingers like warm ivy. "Well," he whispered, "didn't see that coming." When the connection clicked into place, the lights throughout the entire station flared. Not violently this time, but brilliantly, as if the station itself were proud. Rusty stepped back and let out a low whistle. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "you might be smarter than half the people I've worked with." A faint vibration ran through the floor under his feet. For the first time, he was sure it was laughing. By the end of the second week, the station was running more smoothly than it ever had, maybe even more smoothly than when it was first built. Oxygen levels were perfect. Power efficiency was higher than he thought possible. The lights glowed warmly, and the walls no longer oozed or groaned in pain. More than that, the station now anticipated him, laying out tools, guiding him with subtle pulses, even adjusting the lighting and temperature as he worked. It had become more than just a structure. It had become a partner. Rusty leaned against the wall of the observation deck one night, mug of coffee in hand, and looked out at the stars. You know, he said aloud, you're not so bad for a sulky, half-dead alien brain. And to think they wanted to put you out to pasture. The walls pulsed faintly in reply, warm and steady, like a contented heartbeat. He took a sip of his coffee, feeling more at home than he had in months. You and me, partner, he said, we're just getting started. And somewhere deep in its core, the station seemed to agree. By day 5, Rusty McFix had stopped treating the station like a job and started treating it like a very large, very moody roommate. He even gave it a name, Bessie. It seemed appropriate. Back home on the farm, Bessie was the cow who tried to gore anyone who came near her until Rusty figured out she just hated the smell of cologne. After that, they got along fine. Well, this station was basically the galactic equivalent of that cow, except with more tentacles and a worse attitude. That morning, Rusty woke up to find the walls of his quarters watching him. Not literally. It didn't sprout eyes or anything, thankfully, but the faint bioluminescent veins running through the walls and ceiling glowed brighter as soon as he sat up. And when he swung his legs out of bed and stood, the lights by the door flared just slightly, as though encouraging him to hurry the hell up already. Oh, don't start bossing me around now, he grumbled, pulling on his jumpsuit. You're the one that nearly suffocated me last week. The lights flickered in what could only be interpreted as a sassy little twinkle. He walked the corridors with his usual mug of stale coffee and a wrench tucked into his belt. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but over the last 2 days, the station had started to guide him. The lights would brighten just ahead of him, dim slightly in the wrong direction, even pulse faintly over problem areas like a big, glowing arrow saying, "Fix me here, idiot." So he followed. Every morning, he let Bessie lead him to whatever junction, conduit, or gooey tangle of alien biotubes needed his attention that day. And every morning, the repairs went faster, cleaner, easier. By lunch, he was whistling to himself while he worked, and he swore the walls actually hummed faintly in time. The first time Bessie actually helped, though, that was something else entirely. Rusty was halfway through replacing one of the massive power conduits with his hybrid alloy, carefully easing the piece into place while holding his breath. When it happened, thin filaments of living tissue slid out of the walls like careful fingers and wrapped gently around the hybrid piece. At first, Rusty froze. What are you doing?" The filaments tightened just enough to guide the piece perfectly into position and then reseated. He stood there blinking. Then he laughed so hard his coffee sloshed onto the floor. "Well, hell, you finally decided to meet me halfway." He patted the nearest wall and grinned. "Good girl, Bessie." The wall glowed a little brighter in response. By the next day, it was clear Bessie had started anticipating him. When he arrived in engineering, he found a brand new set of tools laid out on the workbench. Tools, mind you, that he hadn't put there. They were alien in design, but modified ever so slightly, so that his clunky human fingers could actually use them. "Look at you," he murmured, picking up what looked like a screwdriver with tiny, flexible tendrils at the tip. "Playing housekeeper for me now." The walls pulsed faintly. "Fine," he said, "but don't expect a tip." The real test of their partnership came when Rusty started dreaming bigger. Sure, keeping the station alive was good, but why stop it alive when you could make it better? He sat down in front of the bioneural brain with his tablet one evening, the tablet he'd already modified to talk to the station. "Okay, Bessie," he said, leaning back against the warm, softly pulsing wall. "Let's stop patching leaks and start building." He sketched a plan on the screen. Reinforce the power grid with hybrid connections. Extend life support to areas the Zorpians had written off. Maybe even, if Bessie was feeling ambitious, grow a proper hydroponics bay, so he didn't have to keep eating those chalk-flavored rations. He plugged the tablet into the interface port and waited. The walls flared so brightly, they nearly blinded him. "Oh, you like that idea, huh?" A soft vibration ran through the floor under his boots, subtle but unmistakable. "Yes. Guess we're both sick of doing the bare minimum," he said. "Let's get to work." From that point on, everything changed. Whenever Rusty proposed an idea, Bessie would counter with one of her own, usually better. When he reached for a tool, she'd extend a little tendril and hand him the right one. When he sketched a schematic for rerouting power through an old conduit, the walls would pulse faintly and guide him toward a hidden pathway he didn't even know existed. It was, and Rusty didn't say this lightly, the best damn partnership he'd ever had. Sure, she was a bit dramatic. Every now and then the lights would flare unnecessarily or the floor would thrum like an annoyed cat, but at least she listened, which was more than he could say for most of the humans and all of the Zorpians he'd ever worked with. By the end of the week, they had fallen into a rhythm. Each morning, Bessie would gently nudge him awake by brightening the bio lights in his quarters. Each afternoon, they'd tackle another section of the station, repairing, improving, and sometimes even growing entirely new components. And each night, he'd sit on the observation deck with his coffee, watching the stars while the walls pulsed contentedly around him. Not bad for a couple of rejects, he said one evening. Bessie glowed warmly in response. One day, while repairing a critical junction in the power distribution system, something remarkable happened. Instead of waiting for Rusty to install the hybrid connector, the bioneural fibers extended ahead of him, already preparing the site, clearing away the old material, and shaping the area perfectly for the new piece. Rusty stopped, watching in awe. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "You're learning." The lights pulsed brightly, the fibers wriggling like they were pleased with themselves. "You're not just learning," he added. "You're teaching me." Over the next few days, Bessie started showing him things he didn't even know existed. Secret maintenance tunnels, hidden storage bays full of supplies the Zorpians had forgotten, a shortcut between engineering and the hydroponics alcove, and once a little compartment with a few extra rations and what Rusty swore was a bottle of alien whiskey. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said, taking a swig. Sneaky old girl. The walls hummed faintly, and he could almost hear her chuckling. By day 10, Rusty couldn't remember what it had been like to work alone. Now, whenever he reached for a tool, it was already waiting. Whenever he sketched a plan, Bessie improved it before he even finished. Whenever he started to explain what he was about to do, she'd pulse impatiently, like a teacher waiting for the student to catch up. They didn't just work together anymore. They worked in sync. On the evening of day 12, Rusty stood in the central chamber and looked around. The walls were glowing warmly. The air was clean. The floors no longer creaked. The bio tubes no longer leaked. The station, his station, was alive, healthy, thriving, and it was looking at him, watching, waiting. He raised his coffee mug and nodded at the brain at the center of the room. "You know," he said, "you're not so bad once you stop trying to eat everyone." The brain pulsed in response, brighter than he'd ever seen. Rusty grinned. "Good girl." That night, lying in his quarters, he thought about how the Zorpians had treated this place like a stubborn animal to be broken. But all it had needed was a little patience, a little respect, a partner. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the walls before drifting off to sleep, "we build something no one's ever seen before." In the darkness, the faint glow of the veins brightened, warm and steady, as if to say, "Bring it on, monkey." By the time Rusty McFixit woke on day 14, he was beginning to suspect that Bessie, the sentient alien station he'd been left to die on, was starting to show off. The walls didn't just glow anymore when he walked by. Now they rippled in neat waves, lighting his path like he was some kind of galactic royalty on his morning coffee parade. The air smelled fresher than it had on any ship he'd ever been on. Not just breathable, pleasant, like spring in Kansas before the cows got at it. He stopped in the corridor, took a deep breath, and shook his head. "Overachiever," he muttered at the walls. They pulsed smugly. The bioneural network, the brain of the station, had long since stopped waiting for him to tell it what to do. Now, it actively anticipated him. When he walked into engineering that morning, a toolkit was already set out, his coffee was already sitting hot and steaming on the bench. Don't ask how. He didn't want to know. And 2 sections of failing junctions had already been cleared of debris and were clearly waiting for his approval. Rusty set down his mug and rubbed his hands together. "Right," he said. "Let's ruin some Zorpian PhDs day. Because here's the thing. The Zorpians, the big, gray, 4-armed geniuses who'd built this place, had spent years trying to fix it. Years throwing their best biotech at the problem, convinced their superior intelligence would eventually bludgeon the station into obedience. It hadn't worked, and now here Rusty was a grease-streaked farm boy with a wrench and an attitude, turning this place into the single most efficient, harmonious hybrid of flesh and metal in the galaxy. The next big project on his list was the communications array. The Zorpians had declared it beyond repair before they evacuated. They claimed the biological circuits were too badly degraded, the mechanical components too incompatible. They'd even cut power to it before leaving like a dying limb. Rusty stared at the darkened array for a good minute. Well, he drawled, that's a load of horse crap. With Bessie's help, he started drafting a plan to rebuild it. Not just to get it working again, but to make it better than anything the Zorpians or humans had ever seen. He sketched out his idea on his tablet, a hybrid comm system that would use the bioneural tissue as an organic signal amplifier, integrated with traditional radio and subspace relays. When he plugged the tablet into the wall port, the station's response was immediate. The walls flared with bright, excited light. Fibers extended toward him eagerly, almost quivering. Yeah, he said. Don't get all emotional on me. Work began the next morning. To his surprise and mild irritation, Bessie started taking over. She grew scaffolding for him to stand on before he even asked. She pre-warmed the hybrid materials in little alcoves. Once, when he reached for the wrong tool, a thin tendril snaked out of the wall and politely nudged his hand toward the correct one. Rusty snorted. Oh, so you're teaching me now? Fine, but don't think you're getting a cut of the credit. The walls rippled, and he could swear they laughed at him. Within 3 days, they'd completely dismantled the broken Zorpian comms array, stripped it down to its bones, and regrown it from scratch. And not just repaired, enhanced. Where the old array could barely reach a relay station in orbit, the new hybrid could pick up whispers from ships halfway across the sector. It was so sensitive Rusty could hear static from stars themselves. He stood in front of it when they finished, hands on his hips, and whistled low. Well, he said, I'd say we just invented long-distance gossip. The walls hummed in agreement. After that success, Rusty and Bessie decided to keep going. Next was the water recycling system. The Zorpians had done what they always did, brute forced a mechanical system into a biological one and acted shocked when it started belching slime into the drinking water. Rusty took one look at the system, sighed, and got to work. This time, he let Bessie take the lead. She guided him through a network of hidden maintenance tunnels he hadn't seen before, lined with soft, glowing fibers that seemed to hum in approval when he passed. Together, they tore out the old pipes and grew a completely new filtration system. Bioneural tissue laced with his hybrid alloy, designed to filter and purify water on a molecular level. When he finally took a sip of the finished product, clear, cold, perfect, he nearly cried. You know, he told the station, you're wasting your talents here. You could be bottling this and selling it at a markup. A faint vibration underfoot suggested that Bessie found the idea amusing. Then came food production. Rusty was sick of chalk-flavored rations, and he suspected Bessie was sick of watching him gag on them. So he suggested they grow a proper hydroponics bay, something to keep him alive and keep the air balanced. Bessie didn't just comply. She seemed delighted. By the next day, a lush, bioluminescent garden had sprouted in the corner of the research wing, complete with alien fruits, vegetables, and a few plants that glowed like little green candles at night. Rusty bit into a purple fruit he couldn't name and nearly wept. Well, he muttered, if the Zorpians ever come back, I'll sell tickets. By the end of the 4th week, the station was completely unrecognizable. What had once been a dim, dying monument to Zorpian hubris was now a sleek, glowing, living machine, more efficient, more intelligent, and more beautiful than it had ever been. Everywhere Rusty walked, the walls pulsed warmly. The air smelled fresh. The lights followed him like a spotlight, highlighting the work they'd done. And he couldn't help but feel a little smug. The Zorpians, those self-proclaimed geniuses, had declared this place unsalvageable. And here he was, with his wrench, his coffee, his hybrid connectors, making the galaxy's most advanced space station sit up and purr. One night, while sitting on the observation deck with a mug of thankfully no longer awful. Rusty watched the stars through the massive viewport. You know, he said to the walls, "You're wasted out here. With what you can do, you should be running whole fleets." The walls glowed faintly, like a shy blush. Rusty chuckled and shook his head. "Don't look at me like that. You're the brains in this outfit. I just hold the wrench." But he couldn't deny the sense of pride that bubbled up when he looked around. For the first time since the Zorpians left, he wasn't just surviving here. He was thriving. And so was Bessie. The most telling moment of all came one morning when he woke to find an entire new corridor had grown overnight. It was perfect, smooth walls, bright lights, hybrid conduits already in place, and even little alcoves for tools. Rusty stood in the doorway, jaw slightly slack. "You made me an office," he muttered. The walls pulsed, bright and proud. "An office," he repeated, grinning. "Well, that's downright domestic of you." He walked in, set his coffee down on the grown-in desk, and ran a hand over the warm, glowing surface. "Well," he said with a smirk, "looks like we're officially business partners now." When he checked the energy readouts that afternoon, he nearly spat his tea all over the panel. Efficiency had increased by 200%. Life support was producing more oxygen than he could possibly use. Water reserves were overflowing. Even the communications array was picking up faint signals from ships and stations so far out they didn't even appear on human or Zorpian maps. Rusty sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "They're going to lose their minds when they see this," he said. The walls flared in what he was certain was quiet amusement. Later that night, he sat back on the observation deck and watched the stars. "You know," he told Bessie, "we're making the rest of them look bad." A faint ripple ran through the deck plates, and the lights brightened, just for a moment, like the station was nodding in agreement. Rusty leaned back, hands behind his head, and smirked. "Out-engineered the engineers," he said to no one in particular. "Not bad for a farm boy." And somewhere deep in its core, the station pulsed warmly, proud and satisfied. It started like any other morning on Bessie. Rusty McFix, it was sitting in his new, station-grown office, sipping coffee from his favorite mug, the one with "Not Dead" yet written on it in marker, when the warning lights blinked faintly in the corner of his vision. Incoming ships. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, company already?" The walls pulsed smugly, almost like they'd been waiting for this moment. Rusty stood, adjusted his jumpsuit, grabbed his clipboard, and started whistling as he strolled toward the observation deck. Through the massive viewport, two fleets approached from opposite directions. On the left, three sleek, silvery Zorpian vessels in perfect formation, gleaming like overpolished knives. On the right, one human research ship, boxy and angular, and painted the kind of bureaucratic gray that screamed funded by committee. Both groups, clearly, trying to outdramatic the other. Rusty leaned on the rail, watching them like a man waiting for the punchline. "Well," he said, "here comes the fan club." Behind him, the bioluminescent walls glowed faintly with something he could only interpret as mischief. The Zorpians docked first. Of course they did. They'd never been known to pass up a chance to strut. The airlock hissed open, and Commander Velter stepped through with his usual pomp, flanked by a squad of engineers and scientists, all of them clutching data pads and wearing the kind of expressions usually reserved for funeral processions. Rusty, leaning casually against the wall, offered his most charming grin. "Well, look what the solar wind dragged in." Velter blinked at him, then blinked again. "Human. Morrison, you appear to still be alive." "Sharp as ever," Rusty deadpanned. "And good morning to you, too." The commander's four arms twitched in what Rusty now recognized as confusion. His glossy black eyes darted to the walls, the glowing veins, the polished floors, all of it brighter and healthier than it had ever been, even when the Zorpians first commissioned the station. One of the engineers muttered something in Zorpian that Rusty's translator didn't even bother trying to parse. It probably translated roughly to, "What the hell?" As they moved deeper into the station, Velter's team became increasingly agitated. Everywhere they looked, things were wrong. Life support was operating at 200% efficiency. The biotubes glowed healthy pink instead of sickly yellow-green. The air smelled faintly of alien flowers instead of ozone and despair. Even the old maintenance tunnels had sprouted new conduits, sleek hybrid connections that pulsed harmoniously with the walls. Velter stopped abruptly in the central chamber, turning on Rusty. What did you do?" Rusty set his coffee down on a grown-in shelf. "Thanks, Bessie," and smiled. "Fixed it," he said simply. They stared at him. No one spoke, so he decided to elaborate. "You see," he said, gesturing to the glowing bioneural brain at the center of the chamber. "You lot kept trying to treat her like a machine. But she's not just alive, she's clever. Doesn't like being bossed around." He patted the nearest wall affectionately. It responded with a warm little shimmer. "I stopped telling her what to do," he continued. "Started asking. Then I built her what she wanted. Not what you wanted." One of the Zorpian engineers dropped his datapad. By then the human ship had docked. Captain Lisa Chun, accompanied by a squad of human scientists, strode into the chamber with her own brand of skepticism. "Jake Morrison?" she called. Rusty still didn't correct anyone who forgot his nickname. "Present," Rusty replied cheerfully. Chin took one look at the room and stopped dead in her tracks. "This isn't what we expected." "That," Rusty said, crossing his arms, "sounds like a you problem." Her eyes narrowed. "We were told the station was failing." "Oh, it was," Rusty said casually. "But failure's just success that got scared." Both crews, Zorpian and human, spent the next 2 hours stumbling through the corridors while Rusty narrated like a tour guide at a theme park. "Over here," he said, waving his wrench, "you'll see our hydroponics bay, which I built with Bessie's help after your delightful rations ran out." On cue, the walls lit the way to a lush, thriving garden full of alien vegetables and softly glowing fruits. One human scientist actually started crying softly at the sight. "And here," Rusty continued, leading them toward the communication center, "you'll see what happens when you stop thinking like an engineer and start thinking like a partner." The array, which the Zorpians had written off as scrap, now hummed and glowed with quiet power, projecting a 3D map of the entire sector in stunning detail. Signals from ships so far away they weren't even on the official charts flickered into view. A Zorpian engineer leaned closer to study the display, his hands shaking. This is impossible." Rusty agreed. "And yet, here we are." When the tour finally returned to the central chamber, Velter's composure had cracked completely. "You achieved symbiosis," he said in disbelief, "between mechanical components and bioneural tissue. Actual harmony." Rusty raised his mug in a mock toast. "Yup, crazy what happens when you stop trying to boss the universe around." Captain Chun crossed her arms, clearly trying not to look impressed. "You did all this alone?" she asked. Rusty shrugged. "Well, alone with a stubborn alien brain that hated my guts at first but warmed up once I stopped insulting her." The walls pulsed warmly at that, because of course they did. The next few days were chaos. Both crews scrambled to document everything, scanning hybrid connectors, testing the new systems, recording everything Rusty said, as though he were some kind of prophet. He just leaned against the wall, sipping his coffee and offering helpful commentary. "Oh yeah, that's the power junction I rebuilt after your fancy alloy melted into sludge. Careful with that panel. She doesn't like when you poke it too hard. Ah, that conduit? Yeah, she grew that herself. Smart girl." More than once, a human or Zorpian would stop and just stare at him. Eventually, Captain Chin cornered him. "Morrison," she said, her voice tight, "you've accomplished something here that's unprecedented." Rusty smirked. "You're welcome." Her jaw tightened. "Both our governments would like to extend formal offers, research positions, engineering contracts, a personal laboratory." "Nah," Rusty said. She blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "I'm staying here," he said, folding his arms. "Bessie and I aren't finished yet." Velter sputtered behind her. "You would refuse appointments with both councils?" Rusty grinned. "Don't take it personally. I just don't trust either of you not to screw it all up again." So they left. The Zorpians, still in shock, departed first, already drafting memos to their High Council about the impossible human breakthrough. The humans followed, only slightly less dazed, promising to send more scientists to learn his methods. And Rusty stood on the observation deck, watching both fleets fade into the stars. He raised his mug toward the viewport and muttered, "That went well." The walls glowed brightly in agreement. In the following weeks, new ships arrived, carrying engineers, researchers, and eager students from both species. They came to learn what Rusty had discovered, that working with the station worked better than trying to dominate it. Bessie obligingly grew new quarters, new labs, and even a cafeteria that didn't smell like a compost heap anymore. Rusty walked the halls each morning, checking on the hybrid systems, whistling to himself while newcomers scurried around in awe. More than once, he overheard them whispering, "That's him. The one who fixed everything. The human who out-engineered the engineers." He never corrected them. One evening, months later, Rusty stood on the observation deck, coffee in hand, watching the stars. Below him, the station glowed like a jewel, alive and thriving, a perfect partnership between human ingenuity and alien intelligence. "You know," he murmured to the walls, "they're still trying to figure out how we did it." A faint hum ran through the floor, like a chuckle. He grinned. Let him try. The walls glowed brighter, warm, proud. Rusty raised his mug in a final toast. "To us," he said. "Not bad for a farm boy and a stubborn old cow." Somewhere deep in the station, the bioneural brain pulsed in what he could only interpret as laughter. Official communiques from both the Zorpian High Council and the United Human Directorate would later agree on one thing. The situation at Kepler Station was resolved through unexpected, unorthodox, and unrepeatable means. Translation: we have no idea how the hell he did it, and it makes us look bad, so let's just pretend it was inevitable. 4 months after the incident, scholars and engineers from across the galaxy descended on Kepler Station to study Rusty McFixit's methods. They came armed with theories, advanced tools, and long-winded lectures about integration paradigms and quantum biofeedback harmonics. Rusty came armed with his wrench and a thermos of bad coffee. Guess who kept fixing things while the others argued? A few notable outcomes. The Zorpians, embarrassed that their state-of-the-art engineers had been outclassed by a human in overalls, rebranded the event as an intentional field trial of human adaptability. The humans, unwilling to let the Zorpians own the humiliation alone, claimed Rusty was part of a classified initiative to test symbiotic technologies. Rusty claimed, "Y'all are full of it. I just stopped yelling at the damn thing." Tourism to Kepler Station spiked 400% after the galactic press ran headlines like, "From Death Trap to Day Spa, how a human whispered an alien station back to life." Rusty was politely asked to give interviews. He politely declined. Instead, he spent his time teaching new recruits how to listen to Bessie, and occasionally muttering about how none of them had the faintest idea what they were doing. The station continued to grow, glow, and, according to Rusty, occasionally gossip about its guests. Zorpian High Council Statement. "We are pleased to announce that Kepler Station now stands as a shining testament to interspecies cooperation and our own visionary designs, brought to completion with human assistance." Translation: we're going to take credit for it anyway, because politics. United Human Directorate Statement. The successful rehabilitation of Kepler Station exemplifies humanity's ingenuity and collaborative spirit. Translation: please stop asking how he actually did it. We don't know either. Rusty's own statement, when cornered by a reporter, was short and to the point. "If y'all had just listened to her the first time, none of this would have happened. Now, if you don't mind, you're standing on my garden hose." Somewhere deep in the galactic archives, a footnote was quietly added to the official record of Kepler Station. Morrison Jacob, a.k.a. Rusty McFixit Human Engineer, not formally educated beyond basic technical certification, demonstrated unprecedented ability to establish symbiosis with a bioneural station. Methods, unclear. Recommended strategy: keep him alive and stocked with coffee at all costs. And in the quiet of the observation deck one night, Rusty raised his mug to the stars and muttered, "Here's to you, Bessie. You and me, showing the galaxy how it's done." The walls pulsed warmly in reply, because of course they did. Thus concluded the saga of Rusty McFixit and his unlikely partner, proof eternal that sometimes the monkey really does know best.